brief and essential true history of Western civilization. We begin with antiquity. In antiquity, we had the stories of gods, heroes, and men. These stories were told by poets, and the poets were essentially the founders of nations, of peoples. Poetry was eminently public, political, and it tied men to gods. It told the story of the universe, of the cosmos. One thinks of Hesiod, for instance. But we have Homer, of course, and Homer tells you about the whole of human experience, where people come from, where they're going, where they stand. At some point, or gradually, if you like, some of the poets began becoming private in a new sense. They went on their own. They went outside of the city. They no longer concerned themselves primarily with the unity of the human situation, but they went outward toward what they called physis, or nature. They sought wisdom no longer in the stories of the old poets, but in nature. Nature was this place where you could have a direct confrontation with truth, which was hiding. Now, these people who went on their own would later be called wise men or sophists. Aristotle would refer to them as philosophers of nature. But Plato speaks of sophists in particular insofar as these, or some of these, wise men came back into the city to teach what they had learned. What did they teach? They taught the naked truth that hides behind all of the stories of the gods, behind poetry. They thereby undermined the authority of the old poets. Socrates came along and he said, no, that's no good. You're undermining the whole order of things, the theological, political order of things. You're undermining the city. You're undermining common sense. You're undermining paternal authority, the authority of fathers. That's no good. So Socrates, in effect, is returning to the wisdom of the poets, although he is reformulating it. He is telling stories that account for the objections raised by the sophists. So Plato is objecting to the naked truth of the sophists and says, no, that is destructive. What you're seeking is a kind of illusion. It's a mirage. It's a chimera. It's something that will destroy the human experience and that ultimately won't work. Therefore, I propose truth incarnate. For Plato, truth should be sought at the heart of stories. So Plato himself starts telling some stories that are most evidently what we would call allegories. In other words, they invite us to seek a truth hidden in them. And this truth makes for the ironic character of philosophical language as we see it in Plato and Aristotle, and before them, of course, in Socrates. Socrates is the ironic man. He dissimulates, one could say. In other words, he hides in poetry, in ways of speaking. So, the philosopher is the lover of wisdom. He is not the wise man because he does not expose himself as a wise man. He hides his wisdom in poetry. He sees that if there is a wisdom, if there is an understanding of things, that understanding should remain within the poetic element within the story. It should be incarnate. It should be incarnated or remain within a finite form. Otherwise put, the infinite is never found outside of the finite. Now, as you can see here, we have a new phase, which we call Christianity here, sometimes referred to as the Middle Ages, but it really is an extension of antiquity. And here we have Plato, who rises to the status of a saint. He's no longer necessarily called Plato, but we have Plato that becomes a saint and the sophist who becomes a heretic. What does this mean? It means that the naked truth is rejected and truth incarnate is divinized. It is raised to the heavens. So, of course, Christianity stands for the incarnation, and truth is incarnate. It is living. It is living at the heart of a story. The Gospels themselves are stories filled with allegories, and the metaphorical language of the Gospels is obvious. Now, faith, we learn from Christianity, points to the perfection of reason. In other words, of philosophy. Philosophy alone is not enough. You need Sophia, but this Sophia belongs to God. Man is to be open, faithfully, having confidence in, right, trusting the perfection of reason, and therefore the possibility of philosophy. Philosophy is possible, eminently possible, because there is a perfection of philosophy, which ultimately is otherworldly. In other words, it transcends all appearances, it transcends the grasp of sophists. Fides querens intellectum, faith is such that it seeks, it asks for understanding, or rather a rational intuition. Okay? So the perfection of reason. The sophist, no good. He is against the incarnation. He rejects the divinity of Christ. The saint obviously does not reject that divinity, and he imitates the Christ. Imitatio Christi. The heretic is eliminated, chastised, but he returns, he escapes, and at some point some of these old heretics figure out a way to respond to the condemnation of heresy, or rather of sophistry, of the life dedicated to naked truth and to the exposure of naked truth. They return to establish a new world in which the naked truth is valued above all else. We must purge ourselves of myths, of the old poetry, of false stories, and we use Christianity, which had in the meantime criticized, if you like, but in fact rejected, but condemned old poetry and the old gods, therefore, as false. So, modernity does the same thing, but it applies it to elements of Christianity that are tied to the old gods and to the old poetry. So it tries to eliminate the poetry of Christianity. So what does it do? It says, we're going to give you a new logic, or a new art of logic, a new art of way of interpreting, of reading, and, well, in this case, of appropriating Christianity. Christianity is fine. It shows us the difference, the separation between truth and lies and poetry. Now, we're going to distill this Christian notion, and we're going to establish pure reason, or science, as opposed to feelings. Now we're going to keep the feelings. We're going to keep the feelings that are pure feelings. And we're going to say that Christianity gives us those pure feelings that have been purged of the old God. So these feelings need, however, support. They need support. Christianity needs help. And they need support from reason, the new science, which will work together with the feelings of religion, or a new religious feeling, or a new religion of feeling, we might say today. But at the time, the point was that Christianity had undergone corruption throughout the Middle Ages because of the church, what we call today the Catholic Church, and so we needed to purge the Christianity of this element of paganism. So the Christian medieval church was still tied to pagan sentiment or to pagan poetry, right? So we need to purge it of that. And well, now we will have pure feelings, the pure heart. But this pure heart, of course, needs our support. We need an historiography, a historical consciousness. We need an historical school of interpretation to purge Christianity again of the bad elements of poetry. Now, this purging, in the long run, becomes a discipline on its own. The purging opens up a kind of Pandora's vase, and it says, well, we need to explore this nature that can contaminate our pure heart. Our pure heart in Descartes becomes the ego, ultimately, the pure ego. And this world that contaminates it, that obscures it, confuses us, right? We need to set it straight. We need to plan it out. We need to decipher it. We need to ultimately digitize it. We need everything in an appropriate place, in a little drawer, in a compartment. We need to compartmentalize nature. Once we establish this compartmentalizing of nature, then we can have pure feelings, religion, all safe and cozy. However, when this is done, by the time this process is achieved, what we have is, well, pretty much what we have today. Namely, religion reduced to the ego's feelings. Now, of course, you can have a bunch of these egos gathered into a church and paying tributes to this religious egoism, or the religion of the ego's feeling. And this religion of the ego's feeling is, in fact, the plaything of this new logic, just as much as the new sciences are the plaything of this new art, this new logic, which is none other than old sophistry that has transformed to establish a world that would be in the service of sophistry. This new world, in which sophistry is triumphant, in which the ego's sentiment works hand in hand with the digitizing of nature, and so the taming of nature and the controlling, the mastery of nature, therefore of the elements of chance, of material necessity, for the sake of the establishment of, well, the world in which the sophist is king. This new world we call technocracy. Now, technocracy, just happens to be, will have to deal with Plato's prophecy. Plato had said, if you establish the naked truth, then you destroy human society. In our context, the establishment of, or consolidation of technocracy as an open, universal, global society, if Plato's right, would involve a universal collective suicide or conflagration. the total destruction of human society. We have this already through what we call the virtualization of communities, of societies. We have no longer any real communities. We have old communities, which are also closed communities necessarily. We have the real community today being the virtual community, which is the digitized community, which feeds off of the feelings of the egos. So we have all of these little groups, Facebook groups, these various compartments. These are simply kind of atoms, right? Little tiny elements that are simply outbursts of feelings, right? Egoic feelings. And these are all gathered for the glory of the new universal virtual society. Now, this universal society, of course, is eliminating our humanity, and this is going to refer us back to Plato. It eliminates our humanity. What is left, therefore, it is something that is utterly spiritless. It is not spiritual, it is mechanical. And being mechanical, it freezes, ultimately. It finds no reason to be any longer. And in freezing, it stops, it ends, it explodes, if you like, hence the conflagration. The elimination of humanity from the world is going to be the end of the world. And there ends our succinct, true history of Western civilization.